Leading off our discussion tonight are Democratic Congressman Peter Welch of Vermont. He's a member of the House Intelligence Committee. He was in the room today during William Taylor's deposition. Also with us, Democratic Congressman Andy Levin of Michigan. He is a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. He was also in the room today during William Taylor's deposition. And with us is Evelyn Farkas. She's a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense in the Obama administration. She served on the staff of the Senate Armed Services Committee for 7 years, and she also served on the staff of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. She's an MSNBC national security analyst. And we are going to break with protocol tonight because, as in congressional hearings, we usually go by congressional seniority here. But I want to start with the freshman. I want to start with Representative Andy Levin, because you said today, when we were just a couple of hours into this testimony, that this was your, how did you put it, your worst day so far in service in the House?
I think the most disturbing day, Lawrence, I think is what I said.
And what was it that you were hearing that left you with that?
Well, I am really intent on honoring our process, and I think it's a process that respects the dignity of our witnesses. And so I'm not going to talk about a lot of detail about what was said. But you have a president of the United States who said in front of the nation, now with the phone call notes, that he muscled a foreign leader to do favors for him about his own political life here in the United States. Is not the past, but the future. Not when he was a candidate, but he's the sitting president of the United States trying to get favors about his reelection campaign. And you've got his acting chief of staff saying that aid was held up, vital military assistance to an ally under attack by Russia was held up for these political reasons. Of course, he tried to walk it back. But today, many bricks were added to the edifice of the case for the impeachment of Donald Trump. And if you're a patriotic American, Lawrence, it's got to be a sad day. I mean, I personally take no joy in this, but it was an overwhelming day. And why? Because somebody like Bill Taylor, an infantry officer in Vietnam, 101st Airborne, who went on to serve the country from his days at West Point for a total of 50 years and counting, Lawrence, he doesn't care about Democrats. He doesn't care about Republicans. He cares about the national security interest of the United States, and he reluctantly came back to serve in the country, as you mentioned, that he loves so much, Ukraine, and he's watching right in front of his eyes a president undermine the national security of the United States for his own political ends. So that's a really sad day. And it just confirms what the president himself has said.
Congressman Welch, did this testimony give, in the clearest possible terms yet, the quid pro quo that some Republicans have been claiming was not present?
Well, it did. I mean, you nailed it really in your opening. Essentially, what Ambassador Taylor saw was that a policy that we've had in Ukraine since 1991. And by the way, he was appointed as ambassador by President Bush, where we had as a goal to help Ukraine fight internal corruption and resist external aggression. And it was a bipartisan policy with strong support from Republicans and Democrats and Republican and Democratic presidents. He saw that unraveling, is what that report says. Now, this is a sordid mess, but I want to go back to something Andy said, because this is really a moment of grace. I mean, this man, Ambassador Taylor, he started his public service on the plains of West Point when he was a teenager and went to Vietnam, and he's never stopped. And he was dedicated to a career of competence and professionalism and the Constitution. And his requirement to serve in this job was assurance that he would be able to promote that policy of bringing Ukraine into the Western family of democracies. And as the testimony evolved, as you saw that in the statement that is reported. He came to see that there was actually a rogue policy that was completely outside of the State Department channels and was intent on accomplishing one thing, and that was getting dirt on Joe Biden and getting involved in domestic politics, something that was obviously bad for us, but it was also very bad for the Ukraine, because the point that the ambassador made was the linchpin, the strategic significance of Ukraine was that they did have bipartisan support, and he feared that would jeopardize that bipartisan support.
And Evelyn, there's a very personal, briefly told, but personal story in his opening statement today that I think everyone in government service recognizes. He talks about being asked to go and do this job in Ukraine for what would now be the Trump administration, and he was very reluctant because of what he had seen of the chaos of President Trump. And he was very reluctant of serving a president who he had really no reason to have confidence in. And there's a friend, unnamed friend, who says to him,
right, he said a former mentor.
When you're asked to serve the country, it doesn't matter who the president is in a situation like this. And we are so lucky that that friend gave him that advice in the moment when he needed it, and in a moment where he says that his wife was opposed to him doing this.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of good people, Lawrence, I know them, who are serving, some of them even in political positions in this administration, because they think they can make a difference. I mean, Fiona Hill is another example. I talked to her before she went in. She is not a political person, but she felt she could make a difference, she could do good. And Bill Taylor, he knew the background. I mean, you can tell from the testimony, he knew what happened to Masha Yovanovitch, Marie Yovanovitch, the ambassador, preceding him. All these people are very interconnected. You know, they've known each other for decades and worked on these problems. So he went in, despite that, probably thinking he could help again.
Congressman Levin, I want to read a piece from the opening statement about John Bolton, in which Ambassador Taylor said, Ambassador Bolton opposed the call between President Zelensky and President Trump out of concern that it would be a disaster. So there you have John Bolton doesn't want President Trump to even get on the phone with the president of Ukraine, apparently because he was afraid of exactly what did happen on that call.
You know, Lawrence, I just want to stress here the importance of bipartisanship in foreign policy and the broad consensus we've had in our country about the importance of Ukraine in this neighbor of Russia. And I have to say, personally, on my part, I'm a kid from Berkeley, Michigan. I grew up with Ukrainian American kids. Places like Warren and Sterling Heights in my district are a big center of the Ukrainian American community. So this is really important to me personally and to my constituents. And I think what those comments you reference reflect is that any normal Republican or Democratic foreign policy professional would say that it's tremendously in our interest to support the development of Ukraine as a democratic society, try to nurture this very delicate flower that's had a lot of trouble growing, a lot of corruption there. Could we help this new administration in Ukraine become a flourishing democracy? That's why Bill Taylor signed up for duty again. And then he went in and found this sort of cancer growing there. And that's what we're all seeing, not just from Bill Taylor's testimony, but from all of this growing body of evidence that the president had a whole rogue foreign policy going on run by his personal attorney, and that sadly too many of our people within the foreign service may have been participating in other parts of the government.
Bill Taylor described the dynamics of the quid pro quo in several different ways. This is one of them. He said, during our call on September 8th, Ambassador Sondland tried to explain to me that President Trump is a businessman. When a businessman is about to sign a check to someone who owes him something, he said, the businessman asks that person to pay up before signing the check. Congressman Welch, as you know, Ambassador Taylor then said, of course, Ukraine owes Donald Trump nothing. Is Gordon Sondland in danger of perjury charges for his testimony to your committee?
Well, I think he is. You know, when he presented himself, he was kind of a rich guy who bought an ambassadorship, and he pretended that it was a good day for him. He got a job he wanted, but he was pretty naive that he didn't know the real meeting was going on in the room next door. But, of course, the evidence is now coming out that, in fact, he was a very active instrument to try to essentially assist Giuliani in the effort to have this rogue foreign policy. So, yes, I think Ambassador Sondland has some reason to be worried about how his testimony is going to be evaluated when reviewed by potential prosecutors.
And Congressman, let me just stay with that, because that's breaking news for you as a member of the committee who's heard this testimony, to say that Ambassador Sondland is now in danger of perjury charges. How would that work? Does that work the way it has in the past, where the committee basically refers the case to what is now the William Barr Justice Department and hopes for the best with them?
Well, the William Barr Justice Department is obviously not paying much attention to this. And by the way, let's go back here, because whatever Sondland did, he's a side player here. The heart of this case is what President Trump said, according to the readout, in his conversation with President Zelensky. And that's where the president asked for a favor. And the favor was to do an investigation and dig up dirt on the Bidens. And the president explicitly said he'd have Rudy Giuliani and Bill Barr call him. And that's the heart of this. So what Mr. Taylor did, or Ambassador Taylor did, is he kind of elaborated on how extensive those efforts were. But the heart of this is really very simple. The president, in a phone call with his own voice, his own words, requested a foreign power to provide assistance in a domestic political campaign. That's against the law. And by the way, he did that the day after Director Mueller testified that the new normal may be Russian interference or foreign interference.
Congressman Peter Welch and Congressman Andy Levin, thank you both for joining us tonight, starting us off. We really appreciate that. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.